Welcome to WDWNT, Drawn from the Vault. Join our panel for an examination of Disney film history from Snow White to the present day. Now, here's your host, Ron Deanna.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Drawn from the Vault, Episode 2. Tonight, we're doing Pinocchio. Let me introduce our panel. First, we have Ashley Jasmer.
Hi.
Patrick Hackett.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
And Laurel's back again.
Hello.
So, tonight, on our second episode, we're doing Disney's second feature film, which, as I just said, was Pinocchio. So, Disney had a huge hit on their hands with Snow White, and they knew they had to follow it up quickly. Production actually began on Pinocchio even before Snow White was done. Bambi was originally slated to be the number 2, but they were having a ton of problems with the animal animation, so Walt decided to move Pinocchio up. The basis of the story is actually from a children's novel, Pinocchio, which was originally written by Carlo Lorenzi under the pen name Carlo Collodi in a serialized form in 1881. This came out in a children's journal in episodes. One of the most famous writers for this would be Charles Dickens. Most of his books came out that way. And then when they were done in the publication format that way, they were collected in a novel form. The collected form of Pinocchio first appeared as The Adventures of Pinocchio in 1883, and the first English translation came out in 1892. Since then, the novel translated into over 260 languages, making it the most translated work of fiction. The only book that's been translated more is the Bible. It has been called the most widely read book in the world, once again, aside from the Bible. At the time, Collodi was already an established writer. He was known for translating French fairy tales into Italian for children's books to be published there. And these original versions of the Pinocchio were really dark, and Pinocchio was a really unlikable character, portrayed as a more mischievous puppet than he is as the naive child we see in the Disney film. And this came into, be a problem when they were developing the film, and they had to scrap production and start over again. But we'll get into that. I just want to go through some of the stuff that happens in the book because it is bonkers. Children's books,
mildly.
Yeah, children's books were a morality tale back then, so they would show children behaving really bad and then really horrible things happen to them. So let's start with, in the book, a carpenter's carving a piece of wood that shouts out, and the carpenter realizes that it's alive. So instead of making it into a table, he gives the wood to Geppetto to make a puppet. And as soon as...
Yeah, it shouts out, ouch. Hold on, pause. He still has to carve the wood that's allegedly alive. And it doesn't sound like that would hurt. Like, cutting and sawing are still going to happen. I don't understand how that makes it better.
Well, he's making a kind of a person kind of thing out of them, at least, instead of a table leg.
True. So then does the wood suffer in silence? Be like, oh, I get to be a puppet?
It's noisy throughout the entire carving experience. I've seen other versions of Pinocchio, and that's how they portray it.
But as soon as Geppetto carves Pinocchio's legs, he starts kicking Geppetto, gets up and runs away as an unfinished block of wood.
Can you imagine like a log with legs just running around town?
I couldn't until up to about 5 minutes ago on this podcast.
Then Geppetto finally carves him into a boy, and he runs away again. And then Geppetto gets arrested for abusing this boy because of...
He's not a real boy! How do you get arrested for abusing... I can't say inanimate objects, but...
Legs.
A block of wood with legs. A blockhead.
And
legs.
He eventually, he's in jail and eventually gets out when they realize, what was going on. But back at the house... Pinocchio is getting lectured by a 100-year-old cricket who's just it's a normal cricket that happens to talk and is 100 years old, but lives in Geppetto's house. This is the basis for Jiminy, obviously, but he pretty much gets killed instantly. Pinocchio, trying to shut him up, throws a hammer at him and squashes him. At some point, he accidentally sets his feet on fire in the beginning and makes a deal with Geppetto that if Geppetto carves him new feet, he'll attend school and try and be a regular little boy. So Geppetto sends him off to school, and he has to sell his only coat to give Pinocchio money for books, because they're not exactly rich in the Disney version, but there's food on the table and things like that. I think in the Collodi version, that's not really the case. Geppetto is really poor wood carver, but in the Disney film, he's got a very elaborate shop. Obviously, he's doing something right. And I think a lot of other versions kind of realize, like, well, if he's a wood carver, he's a good skilled merchant at the time. That would be someone.
It would make more sense that way.
Yeah.
Right. He's probably doing other things besides making puppets and clocks. I mean, he was probably making like teeth, household wares, things like spoons. Anything that could be useful and needing to be carved. So I would imagine a wood carver to actually be pretty essential in a 1880s Florence, Italy. So
Right, and this is despite the way Pinocchio looks, this is an Italian story, not German. But if you get up in the kind of northern part of Italy, you do start getting Alpine areas. And so I think it's supposed to be kind of in that border area with like Austria, Switzerland, and all that.
That would make sense if you consider the scene before the Blue Fairy comes to turn him into a little boy when they're going to sleep. There's that huge mountain landscape in the background, and
there are places like there's resort towns in Switzerland you can ski into Italy from. So Pinocchio does go to school the next day, or goes out to go to school the next day, and then he sells his book and buys a ticket to a puppet show.
My head. It's so meta, and it's like before the time that people would kind of feel like a puppet going to a puppet show fits in. Like, I feel like it's a joke that belongs in today's society.
The puppet master, Mangiafuco, captures him and ultimately releases him. So now on his way home, he has some money because the puppet master felt bad for capturing him. I'm not sure. Where he meets a fox and a cat that talk. The pair convince Pinocchio that if he plants the gold he has, it'll grow into a gold tree. And they tell him this while they convince Pinocchio to go out to eat with them. And they tell him this over dinner and then run out on the check. So Pinocchio has to pay for everybody's dinner. And then as he leaves, a bird and the ghost of the cricket that he just killed, like apparently the night before, try and warn Pinocchio that he's being scammed.
I'm glad the cricket comes back and haunts him.
Oh, yeah, the cricket keeps coming back, and there's plenty of other anthropomorphic animals in this. There's actually more talking animals in this than the Disney version, if you can believe that. So Pinocchio's walking home, and now the cat and the fox ambush him, dressed as bandits, and Pinocchio bites off the cat's hand and runs and hides in the house of the lady or the fairy with the turquoise hair, who apparently has recently died and is waiting for someone to come take her body away. Now that he's in the house, the cat and the fox catch up to him and hang him. At one point, I believe this is where Pinocchio dies. The publisher convinced Collodi to change it and bring him back to life because it was a popular series, and I think they even thought that was a little too dark for even a morality play for a kid.
That was too dark for this story?
Killing him?
Wait, he was hung on a tree, and then he hangs there for a really long time because it takes forever to die because he's not alive.
But I mean, he's already killed a grasshopper with a hammer, and he's run around, been tortured as a block of wood. He's bitten off a cat's hand. But if you think about it, it seems like it would almost have been like a normal trajectory. Like, that's where it ends.
But it was also selling well, so why kill off your, title character?
Also true.
This isn't Game of Thrones.
I was about to say, no one's ever taught Marvel and DC that.
So the fairy rescues Pinocchio from the tree with the help of a falcon and a poodle.
Obviously.
She calls in 3 doctors to see if Pinocchio's alive and how he's doing. And the 3 doctors are a crow, a cow, and the ghost of the cricket. The cricket is the only one who could tell Pinocchio is still alive, and makes it a point to let everybody know that Pinocchio got into the situation because he's been misbehaving. Here's where the scene where he lies and his nose grows comes in, but the fairy just doesn't use magic to get it to go away. She calls in a bunch of woodpeckers and they chip it down to size.
Old school rhinioplasty there.
I mean, how else would you do it?
Saw.
Would you like to play a game?
That's
So Pinocchio goes home to see Geppetto, but Geppetto is on his way to come move into the fairy's house, and they do that because of reasons. Pinocchio runs into the cat and the fox, who convince him to go plant the gold again. And they get to a city called, I believe it translates to Catch a Fool, which is inhabited by all anthropomorphic animals who are suffering because they've been foolish or did something kind of dumb.
I wish it was called Pity a Fool. Sorry.
Pinocchio finally plants the gold for the tree, but the cat and the fox, come dig it up the second he's gone. Pinocchio goes to report that this happened, but instead of arresting the cat and the fox, they put him into jail for being foolish because that's what's illegal in this town. But the mayor releases everybody from the jail early. He's then captured by a farmer because he's trying to steal some grapes to eat. And the farmer uses him as a guard dog until Pinocchio catches some weasels trying to sneak into the farmer's chicken coop and is then granted his freedom. He goes back to look for Geppetto again, where he sees Geppetto being eaten by the terrible dogfish. Pinocchio catches a ride on a dolphin to another island where he is now adopted by the fairy who's aged significantly, apparently. Here he's told if he goes to school and is good for a whole year, he'll become a real boy. So, of course, he misbehaves. He's tricked into playing hooky and getting into fights. And, of course, contacts more random animals. Passes, and Pinocchio does well enough at school and is about to be made into a real boy the next day. The fairy tells him to go out and invite people to a party to celebrate this. This is where he meets Lampwick, Candlewick, whatever version he translates to. And he's convinced to go to Toyland. And they're there for 5 months. The whole Pleasure Island sequence should really take place over almost a half a year. Makes sense in the movie because of, Geppetto's on the journey to look for him and all that.
That timeline actually plays, it fits like you were saying.
It does make more sense how he wound up out at sea looking for him.
So they're there in Toyland for 5 months, and they're eventually turned fully into donkeys. Pinocchio is sold into a circus where he's a performing donkey until he breaks his leg, and is then sold to someone who's going to skin him to make a drum. The guy who bought him throws Pinocchio into the sea to drown him, but fish eat off all of his donkey skin, and he's back to being a puppet again. To escape, he swims out to sea and is eaten by the terrible dogfish, where he's surprised to find Geppetto living inside. They escape. They live kind of a normal life in the fairy's house. Pinocchio works for a farmer during the days and earns enough money to buy a suit. On his way into town, he learns that the fairy is ill and she needs the money. I thought she was already dead.
I think there is in this story. There's the turquoise hair fairy, and then there's the older fairy.
Makes more sense, as much as anything here does. So after he gives the money to the fairy, she comes to visit him that night, turns him into a real boy, and gives him a sack of gold for being such a good child now. So this is obviously vastly, vastly different from the final Disney version. The episodic nature of the work allowed Disney to trim out the parts of the story they didn't want and work on other things. So that's the original version.
Can we go back and talk about Collodi for a minute? I found some interesting pieces of information about Collodi, which kind of probably brings to light about him and his darkness in the fairy tales. But he was an impoverished child, and it was a family of many siblings. He was one of 11 siblings, and only I think 4 of him and 3 others total even reached adulthood. So there was a lot of death in his household. His mother was like a farmer's daughter, and I think his father was, he was a cook. But so he grew up in kind of a rustic, humble home. So I think that's probably where some of the darkness comes from. But I thought what was kind of interesting was how he got the pen name for Collodi. So his mother is from a Tuscan village called Collodi. That's where he got the pen name, obviously. And what's interesting about this town of Collodi is they have a Pinocchio park. It's like a green space where they have Pinocchio sculptures and puppet shows and mosaics, anything that stuff that basically commemorates the Pinocchio history and story. There's even a Pinocchio museum there. So that they obviously revere their history to this amazingly popular story. And if you consider looking at other, history and about Florence and Tuscany, there's a lot of reverence for Pinocchio and Collodi.
So Disney had been working on this kind of near the end of how Snow White was going. I believe this started sometime early 37. Initially, they kept the kind of puppet look that they had in the illustrations for the original thing. So Pinocchio was tall, thin. It looked like a marionette. And they even had some of his misbehaving and stuff like that. But they had to scrap everything after about 6 months and start over. Walt just looked at the stuff they had because they started working from the middle of the film and nothing was working. So, yeah, just 6 months in, they had to scrap everything, which is really an expensive thing to do with animation. And particularly since the shorter production time, in about 2.5, 3 years, as opposed to the four Snow White, they spent a lot of money in those 6 months on it. And on top of all the problems with that early production, it was started while they were still at the Hyperion Studios, and then it was finished while they were at the Burbank Studios because they were building the new studios with all the money they made from Snow White. So on top of having to produce stuff with a whole bunch of new animation and start a film over from scratch, they had to move the studio in the middle of it. And I think some of the first stuff they did was like the sound recording was done at the new studio where they were still working on the animation and the writing at the old one. Yeah, so the departments would be moving as their individual buildings were being completed. That's how the production began, and that just seems like a really hard way to start a film.
Well, they had just come off of the success of Snow White, so and remember, they were sort of in the midst of writing other stories like Bambi at the time, so I wonder if maybe it kind of ended up coinciding with a lot of other things that they were doing, so when you have a bunch of different projects you're doing at one time, things sort of take a little bit longer.
So when they restarted, one of the key changes was obviously the redesign of Pinocchio. The initial work is partially that very long marionette from the original Collodi, but it was very long and thin. So when they were designing the versions for the movie, they were using kind of a more modern ventriloquist dummy, and they were kind of basing it on Charlie McCarthy, which is, I think, kind of what we all think of as kind of the prototype for the modern puppet that, a ventriloquist would have rather than a marionette. It was artist Milt Kahl who suggested making him a little less puppet-like and making him more like a boy. And I think the exact quote was, "Forget that he was a puppet and get a cute little boy. You can always draw wooden joints and make him a wooden puppet after." So if you look at the design we have of Pinocchio, his face is not quite human, but very human. And even his body is just more normal proportioned, except like you just see that they're, the arms are square instead of round, and you can see the, wooden pins. And I think that was key to really making the character a lot more relatable than something quite as alien as an animated puppet.
He has rosy cheeks. I think it's the same technique that they used in Snow White as well, was to create that rougey look.
They definitely did that on some of the characters. They talk about in some of the commentaries, they did that on Geppetto and even Cleo the fish. And the other key thing to making him more relatable was making the character more naive and less mischievous. It's something I think everybody can relate to as, having been a kid. You don't understand things. You don't always have to be bad to get into trouble. That made him likable, and then he could carry the picture that way. But there was still something missing, and that's where they added Jiminy Cricket. The Cricket character from the original story would be expanded upon and kick. So with Jiminy, he was given a name, which came from a 19th century kind of minced oath. Instead of saying Jesus Christ, people would say Jiminy Cricket. And you can actually hear it a few times in Snow White. The dwarves use the phrase twice when they're startled. I believe they're both in the scene where they're trying to sneak into the house, and every time they get surprised, one of them says it. The supervising animator for Jiminy was kind of immortal, Ward Kimball. Most Disney fans are going to know who he was as classic animator and Imagineer, or one of the early Imagineers. Ward got the job because he was originally in charge of the cut soup eating scene from Snow White, and he felt, kind of despondent that he worked on the scene for 8 months, and then Walt's like, "It just doesn't work. We're going to get rid of it. Sorry." And he kind of seemed to present that he might be leaving the company, so Walt gave him one of the key characters to design and draw for the new one, and that's how he got to take over Jiminy. And Jiminy is probably more key to the movie than anybody else, even Pinocchio in it, and more enduring. I mean, Pinocchio doesn't really appear much in other media, but I mean, other than Tinkerbell and Mickey, can you think of a Disney character that's kind of as ubiquitous as Jiminy?
Well, Jimmy kind of becomes the spokesperson of the Disney company and their brand. I mean, the making of Jiminy almost is the beginning of what we would consider Disney magic.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say he hosted Wishes for all those years.
He hosted Wishes. He hosted Spectrum Magic. He used to host a lot of the educational shorts.
Yeah.
I was just over my mom's house, and I was telling her that I was coming home to do this show, and I was talking about Pinocchio, and she immediately started spelling encyclopedia because that's what Jiminy Cricket taught her to do.
But Jiminy Cricket also was in other movies. He was in Mickey's Christmas Carol. He was in Fun and Fancy Free. There is a whole list of just random like Jiminy Cricket credits through the years. It's crazy. He's really like the most used icon of the brand. And by far, he's great. He's the best sidekick. He's my sidekick. I mean, he's funny. He's likable. He's the best lines. My favorite line in the movie, he says, if you remember the scene in the beginning where they're dancing with the wooden puppet, and then Jiminy's underneath this music box, and he gets underneath all of the cogs and the wheels, and he's trying to get out of there, and he's like, ouch, oh, he's getting me, and he finally squeezes his way out, and he goes, there's a lot of downbeat under there.
One thing I found out in the last couple of weeks doing the research for this, and it was completely random, I was just watching something else's, Jiminy was even like the original version of the Disney World 7 Must-Do Stacy.
Yeah.
And then like in the late 80s, he hosted the resort TV video. They really made him the like person like, oh, you need to explain something? Use Jiminy.
I would almost have the theory that and we might be skipping ahead, but I think it's because he opens the movie singing When You Wish Upon a Star. And that is...
Like he opens and closes.
Yeah, and that's the classic Disney song.
It's a bookend.
So Jiminy's design went through many phases. Originally, he was looking much more like a real cricket. Then it was more of an upright cricket with a coat, with a high collared neck. But eventually we get to the version we do, which looks like a small man with a peanut for a head, in my opinion. Ward Kimball once said, the only thing that makes him a cricket is because we call him one. And it's true. I mean, he has, just 4 limbs, unless there's 2 hidden under his clothes, but we just accept that he's the cricket. One of the things I was thinking about with this is you often hear people lamenting that modern Disney and mainly other animation studios may have bits and pieces that don't really fit, like they're a little anachronistic, a little out of time for the movie, but Jiminy really was, the very modern American kind of character, very wisecracking, and it worked there, and, it's not something new, and it's something I think when people want to find something to complain about, they forget about that.
I think he felt almost like a character you would see in the streets of New York City at that point in time. Like he almost looked like he belonged with the Newsies,
We're talking about those complaints of modern animation. The other one is they rely too heavy on famous voice talent, but unlike Snow White, most of the actors in this would be people that the audience would recognize the voice of. Pinocchio himself was played by Dickie Jones, who was a well-established child actor. And in the same year Pinocchio came out, he was in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. So people would know who he was even as a boy. And, at one point Walt was interviewing adults trying to do child voices and it didn't work. And then they just went to this kid who was kind of like the sidekick in a lot of Western. And it just worked perfectly. He had that, polished yet innocent voice.
Speaking of being in Westerns, Dickie Jones was like the youngest rope tricker. Like back then, he was like 4 or 5 years old or something like that. And at the time, he was considered like the world's youngest rope and trick rider.
Yeah, he was really famous. And same thing goes for Jiminy Cricket, was played by Cliff Edwards, also known as Ukulele Ike. He might have had the first million-selling album. He was a famous musician and actor, plenty of number ones. And he was the first person in one of the early musicals to sing Singing in the Rain in a movie before Singing in the Rain was a movie. So he would be an almost instantly recognizable voice, according to like everybody I've read. Like
my mom, when I was talking to her about some of the research I was doing, I hadn't even gotten the words Cliff Edwards out of my mouth, and I was like, yeah, and Jiminy Cricket was played by, she goes, Ukulele Ike.
And Geppetto was a character actor people would probably know if he wasn't doing an effective voice as much. Christian Rubb, he also served as the model for the character. The Blue Fairy was played by Evelyn Venable, who it might be most well known for the fact that she was the model for the Columbia Pictures Statue of Liberty looking woman.
Can we go back to Ukulele Ike for a minute, Cliff Edwards? So if you're familiar with the movie Singing in the Rain, obviously, like the entire story of how like the Gene Kelly and the two characters get into the movies is Cliff Edwards' life. I mean, he was like this kid on the streets panhandling with a ukulele, playing in saloons. I mean, that whole scene from Singing in the Rain's there. He eventually made his way to the stage doing vaudeville. And then he eventually went to Broadway in a Gershwin film with Fred Astaire, and then like made his way onto the MGM studio lot because he was sort of involved with some stunts, sort of involved with some voice work. He kind of was this all-encompassing person that they could just come in to do random stuff in these movies. I mean, he did like over 30 movies in just a couple of years with MGM. You know, it's just a crazy, crazy story. And it kind of has this sad story too. Like he spent a lot of his later years obviously still working for Disney, doing the voice of Jiminy Cricket for so many different promos, movies, shorts. But he was always wandering around the lot, and they'd like feed him and they'd give him meals and bring him out to lunch and stuff. And the older he got, he kind of became like this Hollywood legend, but not necessarily like for like being a good legend. He kind of, as he got older, he was unfortunately, he got involved in alcoholism and drugs, and it really just shortened the rest of his life. And the rest of his life is pretty tragic. I mean, when he died, he had no family, nobody claimed his body. Unknown at the time, but the Walt Disney Studios were going to go and claim his body and then, and give him a proper burial. But then the actors unions got together and then took care of that for him. But evidently the plaque that's at his grave was bought by the Disney Studios.
When you were looking into him, did you see how long he played Jiminy? Did he come back and do the voice a lot later? Okay.
Yeah.
He was the voice of Jiminy till 1971.
Yeah, so he played Jiminy right up until he passed away.
I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I was going to say Edwards' recording of When You Wish Upon a Star was eventually inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, I think in 2002. And then in 2000, he was inducted as a Disney legend voice actor.
So some of the other quick voices, both the coachman and Stromboli are played by the same actor, Charles Judell, and he was a well-known character actor as well. And one of the funnier things is Gideon the cat, who has no lines in the movie, but originally had some recorded, was played by Mel Blanc, the perennial Looney Tunes voice actor. The only thing I believe he recorded that made it through was a hiccup.
Rana, I'm shocked you didn't get the Mansion connection in here.
Ravenscroft was somebody, I forgot who.
He's Monstro.
Oh, he did the voice of Monster, that's right.
He does the breathing.
His group, the Mellow Men, had a song, Honest John, that was cut from the film.
Those who don't know, Ravenscroft was most famous for probably being Tony the Tiger, as well as he's one of the singing busts in the Haunted Mansion with the group The Mellow Men. He was a member of a cappella group and several other.
The Grinch? Doesn't he do the Grinch song?
He's the voice of Fritz in the Tiki Room. Even if you don't know him, you are more than well aware of his work.
Yeah, and it's funny that he was just a giant whale breathing.
I think the best way to talk about the production on this one is just kind of go scene by scene instead of separating them like we did for Snow White.
Wait, we forgot somebody. We forgot Lampwick. Lampwick is played by Frankie Darro, who is literally the personification of Lampwick. He's just this little dude who is kind of like a know-it-all, talk-it-up kind of guy. And he was evidently a child in the circus with his parents being like trapeze artists.
The movie opens with When You Wish Upon a Star, which, as we said earlier, is probably the most defining song for the Disney company. I don't think anybody's going to argue anything is more synonymous with Disney than that song. It does go on to win Best Original Song that year, and the score goes on to win Best Score as well. These are Disney's first two real Oscar wins. They got a special Oscar for Snow White, the famous one presented to Walt by Shirley Temple with the one big statue and the 7 smaller ones.
Mm-hmm.
But these were the first legitimate wins for one of the Disney features. I think they won several shorts before, but this is the first Disney features. The song and score, Disney did not repeat, winning both of those again until Mary Poppins. One of the interesting things was the award for the score went to, I believe, the two people were Lee Haleen and Ned Washington. Ned was the lyricist, even though he was credited for the score. He had nothing to do with it, so he accepted the award. Then he took out a full-page ad in all the local LA papers to thank all the unrecognized musicians. So the credits end, and then we see Jiminy singing the song next to the Pinocchio book. There are two other books sitting there that you could read the titles for. Pinocchio is sitting next to Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland. According to some of the animators, Walt knew he wanted to do as stories even at that time, but they were further down the road.
I mean, this goes into what Pixar does today. That's so cool. And I just rewatched it. I didn't notice that.
So Jiminy acts as our narrator going into the story, and he's the one who opens the books and tells us that the movie is about what happens when you wish upon a star. And that's, he takes the focus on the wish is more important than the Pinocchio story, I guess. So inside the story, we're introduced to Jiminy again as he's approaching the town in some really interesting animation of the town kind of bouncing as he comes in. He's dressed more as a hobo at this point. We don't have him in his normal outfit. And he enters the house with a lot of gags and playing with all of Geppetto's wood carvings. We see Pinocchio sitting on a shelf, incomplete. His face isn't quite done yet. And then we're introduced to Geppetto and Figaro as they come in to paint him. Oh, Figaro is a cat. The blend of colors used on Figaro is a form of dry brushing, where they scrape most of the paint off to kind of get those weird edges to the paint. You can see it's a very blended edge with all those blacks and grays and whites. And it kind of looks a little real. It looks kind of real at times.
I was going to say, one of the things that first stood out to me is the way Figaro looked. He looked like animation from a later time period. It kind of stuck out for me. I had no idea. I didn't have that knowledge till just now. That's really cool.
Yeah, I was actually reading about the artist who did Figaro. The artist was talking specifically about the scene, in the writing. He was talking about the scene where, how like he bounces on the bed and he's kind of he's not really bouncing, he's like falling into the bed as he's trying to get up to the window to close the window. He talked so much about perfecting the movements in that scene. It was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. But once he figured it out, and once he figured out how spongy he needed him to be, it was like it just opened a door. And then it was like everything else just started coming together. But really, they strived a lot to make him personified, but without words.
Yeah, his face really tells a story.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you can still very much tell what he's thinking. So
very moody cat.
Yeah.
But he is still a cat, which is a big thing they have to do because there's Gideon later on who's a completely anthropomorphic cat. So they have to kind of draw this line between real animals and the human-esque animals.
The Goofy and Pluto conundrum.
Right. That's exactly what I thought. And Figaro does have things where he reacts with some personality, but not that different from a real cat would. Geppetto here gives Pinocchio his name. The fish Cleo or Figaro approve of. Figaro is a cat. Geppetto turns on all of the intricate music boxes, dances around the room with Pinocchio. This scene is animated by Frank Thomas, one of the Disney legendary animators, one of the 9 old men. And what's different about this is how they have to animate Pinocchio here is so different from later in the film, because here he has to be lifeless. And if you look at it, he's on the strings, and when he moves around, nothing's natural. He clinks to the floor like wood. His movements look like they're jerky and this and that.
What I love so much about that scene, well, obviously is so different. But I love the sound that he clunks around like wooden clogs on stones or something. I love it. The whole scene is just so perfect, especially when you have the juxtaposition of the moment when he becomes alive and he's like,
And it's still the same model of the character. They don't suddenly make him from the puppet version to the real boy, yet. He still looks exactly the same. So it is all on the animator's skill of how they have him move that conveys that. And in this scene, you see, how caring Geppetto is for not only Pinocchio, but Cleo and Figaro. And Figaro is a cat. You really get who Geppetto is. So they all go to bed. Figaro has his own little bed. curls up here, I think, in the neck of a violin. And then Geppetto realizes, they didn't have the window open before they go to bed. So he said to open the window, and they see the first wishing star of the night. And here Geppetto wishes for Pinocchio to be a real boy. Actually, the Starlight, Starbright wishing poem is actually kind of contemporary to the original Hulati story. It is a 19th century poem, so it wasn't made up for this. It's something people would have known at the time. Jiminy's kept awake and notices all this because there's dozens, if not hundreds, of ticking clocks all around the room, all brilliantly and beautifully detailedly animated. Design for the village and the woodwork were two. They're not really animated; they're more art, like actual.
Oh, the background artists.
Background artists, Albert Herder and Gustav Tegrin. Claude Coates took some of their work and expanded on it to do the work. But we talked about the dwarves' cottage being detailed animation. I mean, piece of wood in Geppetto's shop is, you can tell it's a woodcarver's shop. There's faces on jugs, on everything. Everything just is so real, and nothing today has this kind of detail to it.
So, we go with the Pixar theory that all the Pixar films happen in a shared universe. The first thing I thought of was that this looked like Geppetto put together the dwarves' cabin.
I could see that. Well, so what's interesting about the detail of those clocks is that every single clock had a maquette. And this movie was the beginning of their maquette department, where they were making all of the figures. Some figures obviously would be used for film that would then be used later to play back so they could animate. But a lot of these were the maquettes that they would have at their desk, so they could have the 3D image of whichever character once it was a completed design. But every clock had a maquette. And some of those clocks are just super cool. The one that always stands out to me, though, is the one with the mom that's spanking the child, because it's kind of like foreshadowing for the whole movie being a morality story. Like, of course, there will be a clock that has to do with morality.
Yeah, there's a lot of great clocks. There's very German cuckoos. Jiminy keeps kind of hitting on all the female clock characters because they're to scale with him. That's kind of a running thing. Is Jiminy's kind of a trying to be a ladies' man most of this movie, which is kind of weird.
It is, but I do think they do it well to where it's
charming,
funny, yeah, and it's charming.
So while Jiminy's kept awake, the Blue Fairy enters and she brings Pinocchio to life. She explains to Pinocchio that he's not a real boy yet, but if he follows his conscience, he will become one. Pinocchio asks what a conscience is. Jiminy starts to explain. This is where he kind of gets involved with the other characters as opposed to just observing what's going on. And suddenly his tattered clothes, he's put in the nice suit. There's some amazing new types of animation here, and I don't know how new they were, but there's a lot to it. The lighting effect from the Blue Fairy is, seems like a lighting effect to us, but you got to think, you can't light a cell. So as she comes in through the window and the lighting creeps across the landscape in the background, they had to repaint every background cell in a differently light it. So it's not just like you can move the light around. It's like it has to go different shades of blue for night as she approaches. So what would normally be a static shot now has, the normal 24 frames a second of animation to go with that. One of the other new things here was the music for her has kind of become synonymous with what we think of Stinger music for any kind of magic. One of the chief instruments they used for that was called the Nova chord, and it was a brand new electric piano that one of the prototype electric pianos that was coming out at the time, and Disney was one of the first ones to buy one to use in any kind of film, and that's how some of that very unearthly music that you get for the fairy comes from.
I was just going to say that this movie gets a lot of recognition for groundbreaking achievements in the sound effects and in the techniques that are used in all of the different, backdrop type. There are a few very key people who really kind of helped design, like what you said, the Disney magic sound.
Fairy was the chief animator was Jack Campbell, who was also one of the chief animators on the character of Snow White in the movie. So she kind of has a different feel from the art direction for Pinocchio, and I think she does have that unearthiness that Snow White had. At this point, we get to Jiminy singing "Give a Little Whistle," which is another one of the classic songs. There's not as many songs in this as in Snow White. There's only, I think we decided, 4 songs with any real lyrics?
It's 5.
We were listening to
He says, "Little wooden head." He has some lyrics, but the song's like a 6-minute song, so most of it is like the
Most
score.
of it is, it's just the music, but he does have some lyrics to it.
But it's more of a through composed score than Snow White, where it is kind of song break. There's just more of a flow through of the music, kind of almost like a leitmotif to this. Not quite fully a leitmotif, but there's something there to it that was different from the music.
Well, because I mean, even High Diddly Dee, they kind of, in Snow White, I mean, I guess with the exception of the song that they're playing at the Wood Cottage when they dance, the scene doesn't naturally segue into the song. It either opens with the song or they almost stop the scene and start singing. Whereas with this one, it just kind of flows almost more like a true musical, where all of a sudden they're just talking and it naturally starts into the song.
You make a very good point. This is the beginning, really, of that style of musical where the music is a key part of the storytelling technique. It just naturally segues right into the song and right out of the song.
Snow White did that too, though. The songs told the story, and that was something we said.
Well, they did. They told the story, but I don't think it happened as organically as it does in Pinocchio.
It feels a lot more natural in Pinocchio, and I think a couple of times they were singing, you know what really struck me is it felt like Guys and Dolls a little bit to me at times.
Well, I mean, one of the most famous numbers here is actually a play within a play. So it is.
Yeah. Well,
the characters acknowledge that the other characters are singing in this. It does feel different, but it feels very natural at the same time. So when they're singing Give a Little Whistle, Geppetto wakes up. He goes downstairs. He pulls a flintlock musket out from under his pillow.
Yeah, what was that about?
I mean, he's supposed to be kind of poor. Maybe he was in a bad neighborhood and he has to sleep with it.
Do you think that gun was period for the time?
That actually might be a little
too modern.
No, very old. It's also no real set time period for this. I mean, like Snow White was very late Middle Ages, pre-Renaissance kind of look to it. But no, it has to be fairly late. There's a steamship. Yeah, like a standard gun at the time would probably have been a revolver.
Well, the flintlock was popular until the mid-1800s.
But regardless how he got it, he's sleeping with a loaded flintlock pistol under his pillow. Beyond that, he goes downstairs. He's surprised by Pinocchio's being animated. They explain to him what happens, and he's overjoyed and starts dancing around, turning on all the cuckoo clocks again. More great animation.
I don't know how they figured out a time, but I was Googling, and apparently the accepted time for when Pinocchio happened was 1883.
So, it would be contemporaneous with the writing of the stories.
Right.
Okay, so the gun's a little out of place there, but as we said, he's poor and rural, so not under his pillow.
I mean, I think you're right with when you postulate that he's in a bad neighborhood, and this may not have been the first time. He has fine clocks. Like, he might be selling those to some of the more well-to-do people, and you get your hands on one of those clocks, you could eat for a week.
So as they're dancing around, Pinocchio catches himself on fire. Did you guys notice when you were watching this the real big animation error in this scene?
No.
As Geppetto's running back and forth across the room trying to put Pinocchio out. He's wearing his nightcap. He's not wearing his nightcap. He's wearing his nightcap again. He's not wearing his nightcap.
It happens like 6 or 7 different. Once you notice it, you can't unsee it.
But if you're not looking for it, you're not going to see it either. It's not like glaring, but it is definitely there as an issue if you know about it. We get to the next morning with one of the most complex animated shots, I think, done in any hand-drawn animation, where they're cutting across and panning, going through several layers as they push into the village to see Pinocchio getting ready for school. This wasn't done with a traditional vertical multiplane. This had to be set on its side because they had to be able to pan shots. They had to be able to move frames from pull out the things as they go, so it looks like you're moving from left to right. This one shot alone in 1930s dollars was estimated to be almost $50,000 for this couple of seconds of just background shot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whenever Roy kept saying, Walt, we can't afford to do this crazy stuff, and he's like, why are we doing this? And Walt said, because we.
Even that, this is one of the ones Walt's like, we're not doing that one again. That was ridiculous.
So that is almost $900,000 in today's dollars. I don't think there's a shot in Avatar that costs that much.
For about 4 or 5 seconds of an establishing shot.
And what's really crazy is I made a mental note to myself to bring this up when we were doing the episode, is because I'm like, this feels like the multiplane, but more. And so I was really interested to see, they're just so great at innovating, and that's brilliant. Turn it on its side and slowly pan with it. And the shot, it has such depth.
So Pinocchio is now leaving for school, where he runs into the cat and the fox. Here they're given names of Gideon and Honest John, also known as Foulfellow, which I believe just happens to be his last name. They convince the naive Pinocchio to go join Stromboli's puppet show, which happens to be in town. Previously, they had sold Gideon to the puppet show, and got him to steal some money and run off. So they have a history of trying to deceive Stromboli, who's the traveling puppeteer. Jiminy's not around at this time to tell Pinocchio he's doing something foolish. He apparently slept in, woke up late, and he's struggling to catch up. You see him finally meet up with the 3 characters as they're trying to convince Pinocchio to come be an actor, that he doesn't need school. There's some great angles of animation here, down from Jiminy's point of view, overhead shots, just, not something you'd standardly see in any kind of animation today. And it's just really cool ways they originally at that time tried to make animated films look real by doing those different camera angles. One of the fun notes I got from the flower that Jiminy is standing on to lecture Pinocchio on what's right is called a jack in the pulpit. So he's literally standing on a pulpit to preach. And here we go to what might be one of the most famous scenes in the movie is the Got No Strings dance number. The animation here really shows that Pinocchio is still a puppet the way he moves, even though he is self-animated. He spins his head around. He does things that a human body can't, but he still is differently animated from the marionettes around him. So he's in this weird kind of limbo.
Do you know that was the last scene that they made for the movie? It took them the longest to make the whole puppet show scene.
And it is really complex because of the way he has to move, the way the puppets have to move differently. There's so many of them. It has to tell you all those things at the same time. But Pinocchio is a huge hit with the crowd. They shower him with money. You find out Geppetto is, kind of searching for him at this point. He doesn't know where Pinocchio went off to. Stromboli's talking to Pinocchio kind of cordially at the time, and then Pinocchio says he needs to go home. Stromboli turns into the villain again, locks him in the cage, and runs off. Jiminy comes back in at this point and starts to say goodbye to Pinocchio because he thinks he's going to go off and be this actor. Tries him from the cage, but a futile attempt. But then the fairy comes in, and here is the nose growing scene with some great animation with different lighting. Pinocchio swaying back and forth in a cage that's moving in a moving wagon. Just a lot of really complex stuff here, including, almost a 3D effect with the nose coming at a point of view.
I forgot about the whole bird's nest on the nose kind of thing.
You did?
Yeah,
That's one of my favorite parts.
I didn't remember it, and it really caught me and gave me a good chuckle.
I remembered it was there. I didn't remember it kind of decays. One of the really cool things about the animation here was how they did that wagon. They actually filmed a model of a wagon being moved away because it has to move in a certain kind of jerky way that's kind of hard to picture in your head unless you're seeing it. So they actually literally, we talked about rotoscoping before, that they would look at something and use it as a basis, do a sketch of a trace, and then take another thing. They literally just painted over the cells of the animation for the wagon here.
They did that a bunch of times with this. Rotoscoping was really big in this film.
But that's the only one there's, I think, 2 mechanical things.
One of the other rotoscoping was for Jiminy's human-like movements. They use that.
Yeah, there's some great footage of the actor coming along and picking up things that are supposed to be like the hot coals and stuff like that.
You know what other scene was one of the more complicated scenes to do with Jiminy? I don't know if you remember, it's such a tiny part, but whenever he first becomes the conscience and he has his suit and he's like basically staring at himself in like a round, like concave or convex mirror, like it's like a bowl or something. So and like so his face is kind of like expanded as he moves, you know, like one of those mirrors do. And the artist said that it was one of the most difficult things they had to do just for like a few seconds.
Because you have to animate him from 2 angles, have that sync up, and have one of them be distorted. I mean, this happens a lot when they have to animate, any kind of mirror, but adding that distortion effect added another layer of difficulty on top of it. So the Blue Fairy shows up in the wagon. Pinocchio lies, his nose grows, and she frees him. And they're off back to Geppetto's house at this point, where they meet Gideon and Foulfellow again, where they go into this whole, I thought, very Marx Brothers-esque kind of routine, where they're tricking Pinocchio into going to Pleasure Island, because we just seen Honest John talking to the coachman about this whole plan to take naughty boys to Pleasure Island in a very menacing kind of scene where even Honest John's a little afraid of Pleasure Island. But the whole way they trick him in with seeing spots with a handkerchief and stuff, that felt very contemporary comedy of the 30s to me. They're now heading to Pleasure Island, apparently to get a kungaloosh or something. And here Pinocchio meets Lampwick, who's fresh off as a stint as Crutchy in the touring production of Newsies, apparently. And they're on their way off to Pleasure Island. As we were saying, they did the whole thing with the wagon again. I'm going to say here is one place I thought the animation was a little weak, with some of the wide shots of the wagon and them on the boat of the kids are just almost like background Sunday comic strip kind of level of animation. There's just no detail, just kind of round faces with like a smiley face on them.
Giving them the benefit of the doubt, it may have been towards the end, and so we'll just do the bare minimum and get it out of the way.
I know I'm being nitpicky on it, because the rest of this movie, it might be the best animation Disney's ever done.
What I really noticed is the change in color tone, and I think I was so set on that I didn't really take in what's going on. But I noticed how much darker all the tones got. You felt like we were suddenly headed down a different path. You didn't feel that way. There was some positivity with the Stromboli interaction, but this felt really dark and menacing.
Oh, so the original animators who made these scenes were so worried whenever the movies were going to be remastered for Blu-ray and DVD that the color palette was going to be messed up, and it was going to be too contrasty and too bright or too dark. It just wasn't going to have the same artistic feeling that they all put into the original movie. They were just so concerned about it. I don't remember even having this on VHS as a child, so I can't even tell you what it would be compared to the original VHS version.
Phenomenal on Blu-ray. I mean, I don't recall seeing it in theaters in any of the re-releases, but it is just spot on beautiful in Blu-ray.
So they're on their way to Pleasure Island because Treasure Island was like, I believe, the nightlife district of the San Francisco World's Fair. So they get to Pleasure Island here, which, as I said, is the contemporary reference, because that World's Fair was going on in 1939. And when they got there originally, it was a little more almost kid levels of like distractions. It was like cookies and sweets, but Walt decided they had to up it. And so we see smoking, drinking, destruction, fighting. I don't see half of this in any movie produced today. You're not going to, I don't care what morality tale you're telling, you're not going to see, a 10-year-old boy with a cigar.
Yeah, the cigar smoking scene, I guess, is a little bit taboo. And they're drinking beers or alcohol of some sort. And
I'm sure we'll talk towards like a final judgment of the movie a little bit later on, but I feel like he almost approaches the point of no return here. It feels like he's too far gone. You know what I mean?
And he does. I mean, that's kind of the whole point, where he starts to change, but he's back. And unlike Lampwick, who's kind of a ringleader and, wants to be bad for the sake of being bad, Pinocchio is being dragged around because he doesn't know any better, because 5 days old or something at this point. But we find out that the coachman has ulterior motives. He starts raiding crates with these weird shadow men, which are human, it looks like, because they're not even really animated. I think Laurel came up with a theory that they might be another something you could turn into in Pleasure Island.
Right, like older boys, maybe they turned into these shadow people, and they were forever lost and stuck on the island. I think that it's probably a lot of different weird magic. Ron says the magic is just because it's magic. I think it's in the food, because they're eating pies and drinking beer and
Now, one of the things I was talking about that seems to be a sort of a plot hole to me is what's the going price of a donkey at this time? Because they seem to spend a lot of money building this place and then rebuilding it when new kids come in just to turn kids into donkeys.
Yeah, it's an odd choice. I get the very obvious visual and jackass of it all. I guess donkeys are very useful in Italy for transporting stuff. I mean, there's a whole Christmas song about it.
No, we're not getting into Nestor the Christmas donkey.
But there's another Christmas donkey, isn't
Dominic.
it? Dominic the donkey.
He climbs the hills in Sicily.
Yeah.
So back to these donkeys that the boys are turning into. Jiminy had trailed them to Pleasure Island and tries to convince Pinocchio once again that he's doing the wrong thing. But Pinocchio sides with Lampwick, and Jiminy's still learning to be the conscience. It's kind of the other parallel story that's going on is Jiminy's was, this loner kind of vagabond who's learning to be someone's friend and confidant as he's going on, and he realizes he has to stick with him. And he abandons Pinocchio here until he finds out they're in danger, and goes back to try and warn Pinocchio, but it's too late. He's already half a jackass, and Lampwick's totally gone.
Oh my God, that scene though, when Lampwick, his hands turn into little hoofs. Oh my God, that's like the worst scene in the movie. I would never force a child to sit through this movie because of that scene. And then he goes, "Mama, Mama," and then it cuts to his shadow.
Kind of mirrors a lot of the witch's transformation, which is not always shown every part of it on screen. They cut to the shadow and stuff like that. And, part of that might be it was easier to animate that way. And the other part of it might be, their obsession with trying to make it look like a live action film, which couldn't do that. So they would use some of the same techniques a live action film would do, would be to cut to the silhouette. They escape back home, but here now Pinocchio does get to the house and finds it empty, covered in cobwebs. So you do see there's definitely been some time lapse here. We just have no idea how.
Because I think when you watch it as a kid, you don't really appreciate the time change, so you think it's probably only a couple of days, and that's why I think that 5 months, it makes more sense now that was in the original story.
Yeah, the timeline is very difficult to put together in this.
Yeah, they're back at the house. It's obviously been abandoned for some time. They have no idea where Geppetto, Cleo, and Figaro are. Figaro is a cat. The blue fairy shows up in the guise of a bird, which we're kind of not 100% sure it's her, but everybody refers to her as the bird. Drops a note telling them that Geppetto's been swallowed by Monstro. Doesn't really tell you how he got in there. Pinocchio, determined to go find his father, jumps off a cliff into the ocean. Jiminy comes with him. They have to weigh themselves down to the bottom, so there's a lot of really cool animation of how gravity doesn't quite work, how they have to, do I put the rock on my head? Do I put the rock in my pants? Pinocchio ties to his donkey tail that he still has. And, he could walk along the seabed with the rock, but then when he stops, he starts to float again. There's lots of interesting fish around who are all frightened whenever Monstro's named. There's an interesting scene where Jiminy gets stuck in a bubble that he's worried about it flooding, but he's already been breathing underwater. It's also gorgeously animated with distortion planes to make it seem a little weird. And it's when they did Little Mermaid, they went back and studied these scenes directly to see how the underwater scenes they wanted to do in that.
They immediately went to the archives to look at all of the stills of the water sequences so they could decide how they wanted to progress with the Little Mermaid water sequences.
Some of the interesting stuff about the underwater scenes was the voice effect was achieved by recording everybody talking normally on 35 millimeter film, running through a projector, and making the projector mouth.
It reminds me of the Beatles and the stuff that they come up with to do their voice effects and things.
The animation, I believe it was Sandy Strother was kind of in charge of these underwater scenes. It took over a year to do. And it's more than just, there's lighting and the way the things in the background have to move. So it's not just the distortion effect. There's a lot of things they had to do here. Once they find Geppetto, Cleo, and Figaro inside the whale, there's a whole scene where they're fishing for tuna. And even though tuna they used live action references of rubber tuna being flung around that they got from Captain Courageous.
What's the Muppets character that flings the fish?
New Zealand.
New Zealand.
And the boomerang fish.
And the
Yeah.
boomerang fish. That's what I imagine was occurring on the set.
They just got fish from MGM and said, "Oh, you don't need these anymore. Do you mind if we toss them around?" The water effects are really cool. There's things where, like on the surface, where they do thicker lines in front, thinner lines in the back to give you the depth. They did a lot of that kind of dry brushing around Monstro's edges. But just to sum it up, I think Frank Thomas put it best when he described the water as so real a person can drown in it. Pinocchio comes up with the idea how to make Monstro sneeze so they could escape in a scene I think was a lot of the genesis for Empire Strikes Back, Space Slug escape, the way it's going over and all that. I think that was a reference there. And there's just so much going on with the way Monstro reacts, and it's all really, really gorgeous in its own right. Even if it feels. And now that I think about it, if you look at a lot of we have the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston that has a lot of nautical paintings from that era, just because of where we are, from like the late 1800s, and they are all a very dark palette because the sea was a scary, the whalers not returning and stuff like that. So it actually kind of fits that motif now that I think about it, and that just occurred to me.
The mystery of being out on the ocean, I think, still existed at this point.
So they end up back on the shore, but it looks like Pinocchio's drowned now, which he, had no problem underwater for God knows how long earlier. But they bring him back to the house, and Geppetto and the pets are having a vigil, mourning him. It does appear he's dead, but the blue fairy comes in, brings him back to life, and makes him a real boy. And it is a slight different model, but it's still very clean. The same, all that the nose shrinks to be something more, the arms and stuff are rounded off, but it's just enough to tell you he's different, but he's still the same person. Jiminy wanders outside, gets his medal for being the good conscience, and that's the end of the movie.
So the alternate ending was kind of basically where it all ends on the beach. So Geppetto washes up on the beach, the rest of them sort of stagger ashore, and Pinocchio thinks that Geppetto is dead. And Jiminy's crying, the blue fairy appears, Geppetto says, "Save yourself, Pinocchio, save yourself." And then he turns into a real boy, and everyone jumping for joy. There is excitement on the beach, and that's how it closes.
I like this way better. Get him home, Jiminy gets his medal.
Oh, one thing I was thinking about with the way Pinocchio transforms at the end is something, whenever we see a representation of Pinocchio in the parks or anywhere else, he's always in kind of the puppet form. And that reminded me of is whenever we see Rapunzel in the parks or anything.
She's always in the long hair form.
It has the long hair, which but yeah, it's, because we think of these characters in their kind of most iconic versions.
He's the puppet for the majority of the movie.
Well, it just comes up because, like, the way that things are supposed to work in the parks is these characters finish their movies and then come live here. So it should be the way they are at the end of the movie, but, that's inconsistent with the merchandise and stuff they sell. So let's just briefly talk about Pinocchio's presence in the parks. Jiminy's literally everywhere, as we said. He's used in parades, fireworks. Anytime they need a narrator, he's kind of a go-to character. But Pinocchio itself is really, has some scenes in Fantasmic. Daring Journey, I believe, wasn't added until the 80s, which is, it might be my favorite of the dark rides.
I was going to say, it's a fantastic dark ride.
Sometimes there are character meet and greets at the parks. I have a representation of that from my autograph book from my childhood. I would like to show you a few autographs that I collected, just so you know that they did truly exist.
You don't see Honest John and Gideon in the parks much anymore. They were one of the big ones when the Long Lost Friends Day came out, if I remember. But they used to be.
Au contraire. I them. I saw Pinocchio. I saw.
But when we were kids, they were common. They were like shown in.
Oh yeah.
I saw Gideon.
I was gonna say, I want to say one of them was in one of the old commercials where you would see like the Mad Hatter on Dumbo with the kids and basically the free range characters.
And Honest John.
I think it might have been Honest John.
That's what I think too. I remember Honest John being advertised for the parks. By the way, Ron, you were correct about Daring Journey. It opened first in Tokyo Disneyland. It was being made for Tokyo Disneyland for its opening, and then they decided to put it in Disneyland. So April 15th, 83, Tokyo Disneyland. May 23rd, 83, Disneyland Paris, April 12th, 92.
I mean, there's other things like Monstro appears in Fantasmic. Monstro is the gateway to Storybook Land.
And meanwhile, in Walt Disney World, we have delicious Village House.
Can we talk about the Village House?
Do we have to? Is there?
I thought it would be fun if we talked about what changes we would make to the village house to make it better.
Bring back Figaro fries.
Wipe out the rest of the menu.
You know what I was going to comment on? The restaurant is not appetizing to look at.
No.
It is all brown. And, I think we need to brighten the color palette up just a little bit. And they need to have a mechanical puppet show that is playing at all times, just like Sunny Eclipse is going all day long. With
I
his
was going to
shtick.
say what would be really cool is having Geppetto's little clocks and toys and things up on shelves.
Oh, I love that. So you
And
can
maybe-
discover new things.
Yeah, and maybe have certain ones go off at certain times throughout the day.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, this is where the why is Pinocchio German comes into a lot of things because of Village Haas.
Did you hear that and you think, I don't think I realized it was Italian until, I was probably in high school before I realized that it wasn't a German story, it was Italian.
And the food's Italian in the place, but
the name and the way it
is in theory Italian.
Yeah, it's Italian-esque.
I've heard some people say it's gotten better.
Well, we covered obviously stuff in the parks, but let's talk a little bit about merchandise. I actually have a few things. So obviously I wanted to show our Funko Jiminy Cricket that came in our Funko box.
So stinking cute.
Oh, adorably cute. And it's super well made. And then, of course, the little canister that he comes. It's the house with the clocks and Figaro and Cleo. And then I have my original Pinocchio glass that was released by Burger King way back in the day. In the original box. What's really cool about the box is it has Disney Pinocchio facts on it, which I'd like to read. These are the nosy facts. For the 1940 release of Disney's second animated feature film, animators used actual puppets and took puppetry classes to capture Pinocchio's movements realistically. And then Figaro and Cleo went on to co-star in a 1943 short cartoon called What Else? Figaro and Cleo. And then the Did You Know side says, after his debut as Pinocchio's conscience, Jiminy went on to become a major star of Disney TV short cartoons and educational films. And then to make sounds for Monster the Whale, sound men splashed paddles in a tank of soapy water. And then the coolest part about this box is it shows you the whole collection of poster cups. I'm doing some research on some other fun Pinocchio pop culture-y things, so I kind of figured some of you might be interested in this. Pinocchio characters are super popular for Disney bounding because they're so easy. I think we kind of touched on this before, but all these characters are wearing normal clothes and they're all like normal colors versus outrageous, crazy colors. So pretty easy to Disney bound these characters.
We're in the pop culture stuff. Let's talk about some of the other versions of the Pinocchio story.
Don't do that.
We must.
One thing we didn't mention, there was like a 1911 Pinocchio film, which we really didn't look too much up because it wasn't like as direct an influence as the earlier Snow White was. But we watched a Disney produced one.
It's called Geppetto, and it features Drew Carey and Julia Louis-Dreyfus. Wait. The best part of the movie is the story. It's not Pinocchio's story. It's Geppetto's story, and it's completely done to music. The whole thing's a musical. And it's the worst music you're ever going to hear.
There's all these musical numbers, and then they run into Wayne Brady, who's the only one apparently in this whole thing that could really sing, and they don't have him sing for more than 10 seconds.
It's awful. Drew Carey is singing off key like the whole time. In fact, the first song he sings is the worst song of the movie, and it's about parents who become parents and are bad parents. No, it's like all about people who are bad parents.
They don't deserve children, yeah. Renee Auberjonois and Brent Spiner from Star Trek stuff. And Renee Auberjonois is this, Geppetto's looking for Pinocchio, and he goes to this village where everybody has these perfect kids because they're being made from a machine. Like you explain, like, oh, I want a little blonde girl with pigtails. Renee Auberjonois was like, makes the thing, and they're like, oh, and they're like, acknowledge, like, oh, we used to make kids the old-fashioned way, but these kids are better.
I mean, basically the concept is Geppetto's journey to fatherhood. I kind of understand where they were going with this, but execution, so off. But this is like one of the first live action remakes that Disney made. And I think it was a made for TV for ABC.
One of the other ones we watched was the Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater.
Which features Paul Rubens as Pinocchio. The scene with the whale is basically a killer whale toy in water.
And Geppetto Geppetto keeps hitting on the blue fairy who hits back, and they kind of like disappear upstairs at the end of the thing. There's in 2015, there was a discussion of a live action Disney produced. As of May of this year, it's still being worked on with Sam Mendes in talks to direct, and Chris Weitz was doing the script. Chris Weitz did some of the Twilight stuff. He did.
Oh, please no.
He also was one of the co-writers and co-directors of American Pie and About a Boy. So he's all over the place.
What?
But one of the other things we find, there was a Pinocchio 2 in production in the mid-2000s. Lasseter came in and said, no way.
Thank you, John.
Oh,
Lasseter.
my God.
You still didn't touch on the three worst ones that worst ones that I thought you would touch on for other versions of Pinocchio.
The Jonathan Taylor Thomas one?
Jonathan Taylor Thomas.
But you're right, it's horrible.
Roberto Benigni.
That's the other one I was going to get to. Roberto Benigni, Academy Award-winning actor for Life is Beautiful, one of the #1 films of all time. Again, another Academy Award-winning movie. And he is Pinocchio in like the worst English-dubbed Pinocchio ever.
Kevin James does Stromboli's voice in the English dub.
So, yeah, there's been a lot of stuff, and that's what happens when you have these, non-copyrighted works. I think even more than Snow White, the Disney version of Pinocchio has become the definitive one everybody knows, because the original one is just so bonkers.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, how are Pinocchio? And like Laurel said, there's even scenes in that aren't probably suitable for small children. And then you get into start telling them about the actual Pinocchio story, forget it.
One of the things I wanted to comment on, because we were just commenting on the bad stuff that Pinocchio does, the DVD release has a PSA announcement at the beginning.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So it's the no smoking, kids.
Yes.
He's like got
They do it in front of 101 Dalmatians, too, because of Cruella.
Let's see, there were a few other pop culture references I wanted to comment before when we were talking about I Got No Strings. I'm just gonna kind of throw those in there. The Ultron trailer for the Got No Strings version of that, where they do it all like
so creepy.
That is super creepy.
So good.
So the Age of Ultron trailer is amazing and totally revived my interest in Pinocchio. And then there's a Beats by Dre commercial that is all Got No Strings. It's kind of like a popped up version.
that one's cool. I enjoy that one.
And then I wanted to comment a little bit about the beginning of the General Mills relationship with Disney. The first General Mills products were actually Mickey Mouse type products, and they were like on boxes like for cereal and oatmeal and stuff, but they really like weren't taken off yet. And this is really the first like movie-based character. They took the Wheaties box and they made like a face mask that you could cut out of the box. So the kids were like wandering around with their Pinocchio face masks from the box.
I remember those kind of masks. I think the Star Wars cereals had like 3PO ones on the back. Pinocchio
and Jiminy Cricket were featured on the cover of Business Week, because the main article was about lying on applications to business schools. So I thought that was good. But I did want to talk about two movies in that show marquees in the background of Pinocchio. But one of them is The Manchurian Candidate from 1962. And the movie technically takes place right after the Korean War, which would put it somewhere between 1953 and 1954.
Pinocchio was originally released in February of 1940 and then re-released in February of 1954, which would fit where you're talking about The Manchurian Candidate. And one of the reasons it might have in the version fit in 62 was because it was re-released again in 62.
Even though it was filmed in 1962, it sort of works because the timeline of the movie is probably 1954. And then, of course, there's a Leave It to Beaver, Voodoo Magic in 1958. It's featured in the background. So it must have just been an old marquee that was still up somewhere.
There's much fewer re-releases than Snow White, it seems. As I said, 54, 62, 71, 84, and 92. Were all the re-releases. Some of the numbers we forgot to talk about is Pinocchio cost about $2.5 million, which is almost 60% more than Snow White, and didn't make the money back at all at the time. A lot of this they blame was right when it came out in 1940, was when the U.S. lost all of its overseas markets to the war, because the war was already well going in Europe at that point. But overall, its total adjusted gross for all of its re-releases is still a respectable $491 million.
I have it at almost 600,000 for adjusted releases on Box Office Mojo. Number 41 all time, really impressive, especially that it got less re-releases like we talked about than Snow White did, which is 10.
And it was earlier on its first release, unlike Snow White. VHS came out in 95. One of the important things is it was one of the first, if not the first, of the Disney animated classics on DVD in 1999.
It is.
It was the first.
Yeah.
But it was in October of whatever year the DVD release was.
Blu-ray came out in March of 2009. So yeah, those are the re-releases, and I definitely remember this in 95 on VHS.
I don't think we ever had this one on VHS. I don't even think I ever really saw this movie, maybe more than one time as a child. I saw this again as an adult. Love it so much. I totally get it. It's super deep.
Actually, upon rewatch, I don't really enjoy this film. I feel like Pinocchio gets treated too well. I get it. He's new to the world, and he kind of doesn't get the way things are going, but still, he's just kind of awful at times. And I didn't dig it. I enjoyed the beauty of it. It's actually probably one of the most beautiful films I've seen. The Cuckoo Clocks right off the bat blew me away. And I remember talking back to Snow White and how we used the book as a framing device, and I enjoyed all that. But no, man, I don't believe I'd watch this again.
I'm kind of on the fence. I enjoy the beginning until he goes off to school, and then I enjoy the very end when they're back at the house. But the bulk middle of it, I'm kind of with Patrick. I don't necessarily enjoy it. I enjoy it because it looks nice, but as far as the actual story, not one of my favorites at all.
I really do enjoy this film more than Snow White. It's not my favorite by far, and I think I enjoy it much more as an adult. Specifically, I think I appreciate what it is. I enjoyed it, I think, as a child for some of the more adventurous nature of it, but it does feel unevenly paced with that episodic format. I really never really cared too much about the stuff going on with Stromboli, but Pleasure Island was always interesting to me. And we forgot to mention that influence on the parks, but that's long gone anyway. The Monstro stuff, I think I liked a little more as a kid because, I mean, as I said, I've watched this so much lately but I still think, Snow White was first. This might have been the perfection of the craft. I'm
just a big fan of Jiminy Cricket, and I love the humor and the style of his, and the way they crafted his personality. The whole thing, I mean, he's really the linchpin of the movie. And I feel like if he wasn't in this movie, I wouldn't watch it. But because he plays off of all these other things that are going on, all the other characters, he really is essentially like that narrator that gets you through the story. And without him, it's just super flat. But I totally get why amongst the animation sea of amazingness, this is kind of on the lower end.
Yeah, definitely lower end story-wise, but characters, particularly Jiminy, are so memorable and so pervasive. That's going to wrap it up for our discussion of Pinocchio. I want to thank the panel. Laurel, my wife, thanks for joining me on this insanity. And also thank you, Patrick Hackett and Ashley Jasmer.
Night.
Good night, everybody, and let your conscience be your guide.